Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing 3 short reviews of releases from 2020. Usually I pick books to review for the channel based on whether I feel like I have enough to say about them to fill out an entire review, and if I don't, I will talk about them in my wrap-up at the end of the month. But today I thought it would be nice to talk about these 3 books. I think they're all books that I mentioned wanting to read. They're all recent releases, so they might be things that are on your radar. These 3 books are Over the Woodward Wall by Deborah Baker, aka Seanan McGuire, A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, and The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. So if you're only interested in one of these, I'll put timestamps and you can just skip to the mini review that you are the most interested in. Otherwise, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about each book. I just didn't feel like with any of these that I had enough to say for an entire review, but I did have reactions to them and I do feel like I have something to talk about. There's really no common thread between these 3 books except that they all released in fall 2020 and they were all kind of on my anticipated books radar. So the first one, and actually the first book that I read in 2021, was Over the Woodward Wall by Deborah Baker, which is a pen name of Seanan McGuire. She already writes under the pen name Mira Grant for, I think, her horror books. I don't know, I don't like horror, so I haven't really read any of those. But in this case, the pen name is actually because Over the Woodward Wall is a book that started out life as a novel within a novel. In her book Middle Game, there's this series of children's books that are sort of similar to Narnia that the characters are aware of, and it turns out that these books were actually written by a powerful alchemist who had sort of coded messages about the nature of the universe in them. I'm not sure that's the greatest description because it's been a little while since I read Middle Game, but I think that's basically the idea. So these are supposed to be sort of Chronicles of Narnia, Wizard of Oz style children's books, like older children's books, books that the main characters would have read when they were kids, and they're just sort of part of their general knowledge. In Middle Game, we get certain passages from these books that are relevant to the plot, but then I guess Seanan McGuire just liked the concept for these books that she had come up with so much, she decided to publish the actual books, or at least the first one. I'm honestly not sure if she's planning to continue this series, but I actually really enjoyed reading Over the Woodward Wall. It does very much feel like a take on a classic children's novel. It has that kind of old school, kind of written for kids, kind of written for adults feel. Very different than contemporary middle grade, which I haven't read much of, but I feel like books for kids these days are written to be very accessible and to speak directly to the kid, and often as an adult they're not as enjoyable, where I feel like books written in the past, a lot of the times they were still kind of as much to the taste of adults as for kids. I don't think that's really good or bad, it's just kind of a flavoring. So I'm honestly not sure who the intended audience of Over the Woodward Wall is. It's quite short, almost novella length rather than a novel. It does feel like a short middle grade novel, but I really enjoyed it as an adult. I'm not sure I would have really enjoyed it as a kid, although it is completely charming, and I'm kind of happy she decided to write it. I don't think you need to have read Middle Game to appreciate this book at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure she didn't use the passages that she wrote of this book, that showed up in Middle Game. I think those things are kind of rewritten. So the actual plot of Over the Woodward Wall is basically a portal fantasy. There are 2 kids, Avery and Zib, who get transported to a magical land called the Up and Under, where they embark on a magical adventure to try to find their way home. Avery is a very responsible, studious, clean-cut boy, where Zib is this sort of half wild, more impulsive girl. And just like the characters in Middle Game, she has a boy who is good at language and then a girl who is really gifted at math and numbers. Beyond that, I don't think there's really much of a connection to Middle Game, at least not that I can see. So like I said, you don't have to have read Middle Game to read this book at all. Something that I would not have caught, but that was interesting when I noticed it in another review, was that one reviewer noted that this book doesn't quite line up with the timeline for it that's given in Middle Game. So I don't know if that's intentional or just an oversight, but according to Middle Game, the author, Deborah Baker, was writing these books around the same time the Oz books were being published, which is closer to 1900. But although the book as it is now is not very time specific. There are mentions of certain things like planned housing communities, which set the book at least, quite a few decades after that. Other words, it's very generic in terms of what time period it might be set in, but it seems like it is maybe set at a slightly later time than what was implied in Middle Game. So that may or may not have any significance whatsoever. Like I said, I thought this was a really charming book, obviously a quick read. It definitely captured that pleasure of reading a children's book as an adult. I think a kid could enjoy it, but it also ends very abruptly. It's very incomplete. This is clearly the first book in the series. I don't know if she's actually planning to continue it at all. I think when I was a kid, if the whole series hadn't been finished, I would have been so mad if I finished this book and it ended where it did, because there's really absolutely no conclusion whatsoever. It's just about to continue. The style of the book does feel a lot like this mix between Narnia and Oz, where you have this portal fantasy and there's a lot of little moralistic truths and charming characters and the kids going on an adventure, but also learning more about themselves. Okay, the second book I'm going to talk about today is A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. Naomi Novik is an author I've been reading for a long time, but I actually haven't read her most recent books, which are her fairy tale retellings, Uprooted and Spinning Silver. I did read most of her Temeraire series. Actually, my husband just read the first book and really enjoyed it. So overall, I do have a lot of respect for her as an author. I think her books are really fun, and A Deadly Education sounded like something I was really going to enjoy. In general, I love school settings, and this kind of dark academia concept did sound very fun. I had kind of mixed feelings about this one. I overall enjoyed it and thought it was a quick read, but it's definitely not something I'm going to highly recommend. It was basically fine. In my opinion, it wasn't quite disappointing enough to be an actual letdown, but it also wasn't anything that got me too excited. The concept behind A Deadly Education is that the blood of teenage witches and wizards is basically so delicious that these demons are attracted to them, and they generally don't survive adolescence unless they get sent to this school called the Scholomance, where they're basically stuck underground in this automated school for 4 years, where then all these demons are basically attracted to the school, and they are semi-protected in there, but the demons are still kind of getting in, and so kids are still basically dying off throughout their time at school of various horrible causes, but they still have a better survival rate than if they were out in the world. And then for graduation, they have to fight their way out through all these hordes of creatures that have accumulated in the past year since the last graduation, and a certain number of them survive and get out to the world where they are adults and they're no longer so delicious. This didn't quite satisfy my desire for a school story because it had so few of the trappings of an actual school story. For example, there are no teachers in this school and there aren't really classes. The students are basically studying according to this curriculum, and the school itself is basically giving them information and textbooks, but although kind of trying to kill them at the same time. Even though this didn't really satisfy my craving for a school story, it was the kind of dark that I kind of enjoy. It had this sort of grim, dark, self-aware humor and sort of black humor that I tend to think is pretty funny. It was super messed up, but it was done in a way where I personally found it funny rather than horrifying. So even though I don't like horror, this is sort of the line of things I actually do enjoy reading. Kind of like Gideon the Ninth, actually, where the concept should be awful, but because of the way it's told and the main character who's narrating, it's just kind of darkly funny instead in kind of a messed up way. I also want to praise Novik for making me enjoy a miserable teenaged protagonist, something I almost never go for, but I kind of liked the main character. Her name is Elle, which is actually short for Galadriel, and she is an antisocial outcast misfit character. In a world where all the magic users have an affinity, she has an affinity for mass destruction, which means that the spells that the school is giving her to learn, or basically everything she does, just gives her, spells that could kill a lot of people or destroy things, and she has no desire to actually do harm, but as far as she knows, her inherent nature is leading her to be, dangerous and destructive, and what's more, everyone who meets her tends to not like her, and she's been dealing with that for her whole life. But again, this could be super grim and miserable, but it's actually, the way she does it is pretty funny. There's a lot of Machiavellian social maneuvering among teenagers, which was pretty amusing. Generally, it was a very light, quick read. It kept me reading. I don't think there's anything too special here. I wouldn't necessarily strongly recommend it. Even if you like Naomi Novik or you like school stories, I still think this is basically a book that I don't regret having spent my time on, and it was quick enough to read, but it was just, honestly, to me, it was only okay. A couple of the things that I did like about it, other than the things that I've mentioned, is part of the plot is that Elle is constantly getting saved by this character named Orion Lake, who is more of the typical chosen one, heroic character that everyone super looks up to, and she is just super annoyed by him. And they have a very funny relationship that kind of develops into a friendship. I really liked the way that was done. In general, some of the friendships in this book I enjoyed reading. The other aspect of it that I kind of enjoyed, beyond the quick entertainment value, was there's a lot of exploration of how some of the characters from a more privileged background get a better shot at survival and just get a better experience in this school, even though it's supposed to be a situation where everyone is on a level playing field. So I thought those were some interesting elements to the story. But like I said, I will probably read the next book in this series, but it was fine. The last book I'm going to talk about today is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is another one I was really looking forward to based on the concept. Admittedly, I'm not that much of a V.E. Schwab fan. I read her Shades of Magic trilogy, which I thought was kind of okay. As someone that reads a lot of fantasy, it was a fun, popcorny fantasy trilogy that satisfied some cravings while not really having that much substance. But I really loved the concept behind Addie LaRue, which seemed like it was going to be this take on the Faustian bargain, where a woman made some sort of deal with a dark power in order to get immortality, but in exchange also nobody could remember her. So because of this, not only do people forget her as soon as she's out of their sight, but she basically can't affect the world at all. Things that she breaks get unbroken. She just basically leaves no imprint. And I think the idea here is that this dark power that she's made a deal with is hoping that she's going to get so sick of life under these conditions that she gives up and he can have her soul. I've seen some mixed reactions to this book. Some people seem to have absolutely loved it. Some people seem to have really not liked it. I definitely fall in the second camp. I thought this was an incredibly bloated and self-indulgent book, and I almost didn't finish it. The only thing that kept me going is I very rarely don't finish books, and I just had enough momentum with it that by the time I was totally sick of it, I was close enough to the end that I thought, what the heck, why stop now? If I'm going to have a slow, character-driven book about somebody that lives for 300 years, I really want it to be about somebody more interesting than Addie LaRue. Like, there was just a lot of this book that was her walking around and feeling bad about the fact that nobody can remember her. And we got it both in present day 2014 as well as when she first got cursed. And really no development seems to have occurred during that time, except that she has developed better coping mechanisms for how to, get the resources she needs and to survive, which would be interesting for a chapter or two, but it seems like it takes up a lot of the book. And then in the present day, she meets this man who for some reason can remember her, and oh my goodness, I wonder why, but it was just not a very interesting romance either. Sorry, I hope it's not a spoiler that that's a romance. Like, you knew it was going to be a romance, right? Obviously, from the moment that he could remember her. So yeah, he was just kind of a bland character too, didn't really see what she saw in him or what he saw in her, and it was just somehow this long, I don't even know how long it was. I don't think it was even that long a book, but it felt like this long book full of a character living forever and just kind of like moping around the outskirts of history, but never really being able to affect anything or have any meaningful relationships because obviously, nobody can remember who she is. So there are a lot of different times where she met somebody and then it was a tragedy because they kept forgetting her. So the idea seems really interesting here, but it seems like it basically prevents the character from actually doing anything. And then she just spends the whole book feeling bad about that. So yeah, if I'm going to have a book that covers 300 years of history, supposedly, I want a character that does more than just self-reflect. Like, it would be nice if there had been a few observations about how the world had changed in those 300 years, rather than just thinking about how she feels about herself. Like, one of the reasons she wanted to be immortal was because the role of a relatively poor woman in a village in France in 1700 wasn't that great, and she wanted more from life than, to get married and have kids and die, which, makes sense to me. But does she not have any thoughts about, the changing role of women over those 300 years or anything? there are major political events happening, and sometimes she'll meet an important historical figure for about 2 seconds or be just sort of outside of a major event. But it's not even an important part of the plot. It's just like this window dressing just to remind us that history is continuing. If I had to pick a book to read about a super angsty, immortal character with a darkly twisted relationship with their creator, honestly, I would probably reread Interview with a Vampire by Anne Rice, because at least the vampires have some flair. And it deals with some similar issues and relationship issues and troubles with immortality, but just, I mean, that series got really weird and self-indulgent too at a certain point, but the first few books were great. So if that's what you're in the mood for, totally go read Interview with a Vampire. Do not read Addie LaRue. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not going to tell you to read or not read this book, honestly. Maybe you're a huge V.E. Schwab fan. Usually, even when I really don't like a book, I can understand why somebody would like it. In this case, I really don't get it. A lot of times I can tell that something is just not to my taste, or I'm not the intended audience. But when it's something like this, I really don't know who enjoyed this. And really, I mean no offense if you did enjoy it. I just didn't see a lot that would really be appealing. I mean, the writing is fine, I guess, but I feel like these kinds of concepts have been expressed so much better by other books. I don't know. Anyway, this one was clearly not for me, and maybe V.E. Schwab is not really for me. I don't know. I was disappointed by this book. I struggled through to the end, and I thought the end was not great. So that's my take on Addie LaRue. I didn't really want to do a full review on it, but here's my mini review. You've heard my take, and yeah, it was not the greatest. So those were my 3 mini reviews of fall 2020 releases. Let me know if you've read any of those, what you thought. Let me know if you're interested in reading any of them, especially the ones I didn't like. No, just kidding. But a lot of times I actually do have people tell me after I do a more negative review or a critical review that I made the book sound interesting. So yeah, I'm kind of curious about that effect, to be perfectly honest. But thanks so much for watching, and please be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos from me.